So today we finish World War II and go from there. I think we left off around about 1941-42, the German invasion of the Soviet Union. So we should pick up round about there. Talk about the Japanese attack on the United States. A little bit about the course of the war, and of course talk about the fallout, both I guess metaphorically and literally speaking. So first, a little review on Operation Barbarossa, which I think I characterized as the largest invasion in human history. Some 3 million troops, thousands of tanks and aircraft, as Nazi Germany breaks its promise to the Soviet Union, or more personally speaking, Hitler breaks his promise to Joseph Stalin, the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, and they invade the Soviet Union, continuing, one more step in Hitler's grand design to make Germany the masters of the entire European continent and perhaps the world, having had to abandon their plans to invade Great Britain. And I think I talked about towards the end of last time the 3 army groups for the Germans that invade the Soviet Union that are so incredibly successful, both having caught the Soviet Union off guard and with the new strategy of Blitzkrieg and their new technologies, including the Panzers, that they reached the outskirts of Leningrad, Moscow, and Stalingrad within a matter of months, but the Russian winter sets in. And this is what gives the Russians time to use their great advantages in manpower, and in terms of territory, they actually dismantle a lot of factories and move them east across the Ural Mountains, where they'll become the basis for building up a Red Army that eventually by mid-1942 could go toe-to-toe with the Germans on this Eastern European front. This clash on the Eastern European front between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union is the greatest clash between 2 militaries in world history. And you could very easily make the case that, at least in terms of the war in Europe, this is where that war is won and lost, on the Eastern European front. Something that you maybe didn't hear a lot about, read a lot about growing up. I don't know, maybe it's different now, but I grew up during the Cold War, when the Soviet Union was America's enemy. And so you weren't going to hear a lot in grade school growing up in America during the 1980s or even the 90s when the Cold War was just over that, really for those several years there, it was the Russians who were defeating Nazi Germany, or, without the Russians, there's no way in hell we would have defeated Nazi Germany. But consider, and I obviously don't have my notes in front of me, but between 41 and when the United States and Britain finally invade Nazi-occupied France, that's not until the summer of 44. The Normandy invasion, the D-Day invasion, is not until the summer of 1944. Between 41, when Barbarossa is unleashed, and 44, when that happens, the Russians are responsible for something like 90 or 95% of German casualties. And they take on about 90% of Allied casualties during this time. And I don't mean to suggest that America was sitting by doing nothing. That's definitely not true. And we'll talk about where the U.S. was fighting. But in terms of the war in Europe itself, for those years, it's the Russians who are turning the tide against Nazi Germany and winning the war. It's also that Eastern European front in World War II is where you see the greatest loss of life, in terms of millions of soldiers and civilians for both the Russians and the Germans. There are a number of atrocities committed. The Germans, the Nazis anyway, considered Slavic peoples in Russia and Poland and elsewhere to be inferior peoples, and so that perhaps influences the carrying out of atrocities against civilians during those first few months of the first year. But consider, too, after their patriotic defense of the motherland, as the Russians in 1942-43 begin to push back into Germany, they sort of give it back. And there are atrocities committed against German civilians. And so it's very ugly. And again, it's also where you could make the case perhaps where the war was won and lost. Meanwhile, we see the first of these wartime conferences where the big three get together. So who do we got here?
Is that Stalin?
That's Stalin.
I'm guessing
That's it.
Eisenhower? No, I thought he was president.
Well, Eisenhower was the commander of Allied forces,
yeah.
right? And he'll be president after the war. That's FDR, Franklin Roosevelt. And that is Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of Britain. So these are the leaders of the big three allies, Soviet Union, America, and the United Kingdom or Britain. The Grand Alliance, the Allies, as we call them now. And they get together in Tehran, this is in Iran, where they coordinate their strategy. The U.S. and Britain reveal that they have plans to invade somewhere in Nazi-occupied Western Europe at some point. They caution that it's going to take some time to develop, an expeditionary force capable of pulling off what would probably be the greatest amphibious invasion in world history. Stalin is more or less begging them to do that as quickly as possible because, again, it's the Russians who are taking on, 90+% of the German war machine. They need you to cause or to force the Germans to divert some resources to the West. But they say, look, in the meantime, the best we can do, the Nazis, by the way, had occupied most of North Africa, which of course had been colonized during the imperial period by Britain, France, Italy. German army has occupied all of the North African coastline, and so one of the first things Britain and the United States do is send troops into Africa to try to dislodge Germany from there. That is, it's touch and go at first, but eventually, with some adaptation of strategy and a keen use of tanks to sort of match the German might in tanks, the U.S. and Britain are successful, and they're able to use that as a launching point to get at what Churchill called the soft underbelly of Europe. They figure the Italian army is nothing like the German army, and that it would be maybe easier to attack this way. So they invade Sicily, and then they invade Italy proper, and they try to start working their way up the Italian peninsula. What will eventually happen is the Italian army will collapse, the Italian government collapses, Mussolini is dislodged and on the run, and Germany has to send its own forces to kind of block the Allied advance, which they will eventually do in the mountains up here in northern Italy. So again, that would cause Stalin again to be like, look, this is not really, thanks for diverting a little bit, but this is not enough to take the pressure off of us. Meanwhile, as Russian troops begin to turn the tide, as the Red Army not only pushes Nazi German troops out of Russia, but begins to advance into Poland, they are the first to come across these camps, which had been rumored. It had been rumored that, the Germans are rounding up Jewish people from not just Germany or Italy, but all of their occupied territories, which included, by that time, pretty much all of Europe. Denmark, parts of Scandinavia, Belgium, the Netherlands, France, obviously Poland, Austria, Hungary, southeastern Europe. And putting them into perhaps concentration camps, work camps, or perhaps even some suggested extermination camps or death camps. And people didn't want to believe that, particularly in America. The thinking was, well, we've heard that before, and you're in my U.S., so you know. We talked about in the Great War all the rumors of atrocities coming in by Germany that were propaganda or that were reinforced by propaganda. People, it was kind of like boy who cried wolf. Yeah, we've heard that before. Surely not. Well, the Red Army begins liberating these camps, which were primarily located in Poland. And when they liberate Auschwitz and Dachau and Krakow and Treblinka and others, they realize that these rumors were true, and in fact, it was perhaps worse than had been rumored. That, as we now know, Hitler had authored this, and some of his top commanders had come to this final solution to the so-called Jewish question or Jewish problem, which was simply to exterminate the Jewish people, to engage in genocide, the mass murder or the attempted mass murder of an entire people. And so they herded Jews from all over Europe, first into ghettos and then onto train cars like cattle to these camps. And some of them were more or less work camps, but where they slowly worked and starved people to death. And then some of them, a handful of them, were just outright extermination camps, where they separated out, literally as they got off the train car, able-bodied men who would go one way, women, children, infirm, elderly, otherwise not seen as capable of working, to another way. Those people were herded, out to a back part of the camp where there was what appeared to be what were made to appear deliberately to look like shower rooms, and they had to strip down like they were going to get showered off or whatever. And these were actually gas chambers where they were gassed to death using a gas, either a gas newly designed or realized that it could be used for this purpose, or in some cases they just had like a gigantic internal combustion engine that would pump fumes in there that would kill you, within a matter of minutes. And these people are simply mass exterminated. Their bodies are eventually burned in crematoria built for explicitly that purpose. And then the men who had been separated out to be workers were the ones who had to carry out the cremations or the burials, and could have been burying loved ones in the process. And then they're slowly starved and worked to death in the camps. In one case, at least, where the Germans had the audacity to put "Werk macht frei" at the entrance to the camp, or "Work will make you free." This is the Holocaust, and over the course of the Holocaust and the duration of the war, some 6 million Jews are murdered. In addition to, through other camps and other programs, perhaps as many as 10 million more Slavic people, homosexuals, people who were mentally ill or diseased or otherwise seen as not fit for the uplift of the Aryan race. So in addition to the 6 million Jews killed as part of the Holocaust, there's this other Holocaust that, through which the Nazis murdered some, perhaps 10 million other people as well. And this shows you the heavy concentration of the camps, from the work camps to the extermination camps in Eastern Europe, primarily in Poland. The Allies in the West would uncover similar camps eventually, but being as we were allies with the Russians at the time, we very quickly knew the existence of these camps just as soon as the Red Army starts to turn the tide. Let's talk about American involvement, though. Similar to the build-up to the Great War, American public opinion was dominated, and perhaps less so, by isolationism. People were determined to, again, stay out of this conflict, thinking again that America has the protection of the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. This is not, an American fight necessarily. In fact, the U.S. Congress had, after the Great War, passed laws intended to keep America from getting dragged into another conflict like this. If you recall, one of the ways America got drug into the Great War is we were shipping war materials to the Allies, Britain and France, and U.S. banks, big-time U.S. banks, had made big-time loans to those governments to continue to buy American stuff. And so the American Congress passed neutrality acts that said you can't sell war materials to nations at war, and you can't lend money to allow them to do that either. Well, then the Nazis take over Germany, and America begins to perhaps second-guess this policy. because Nazism is seen as obviously a threat to democracy in the world and a threat to America's closest allies, a threat which is very obviously real when France is overrun by the Nazis in the first months of the war. And so America shifts to initially what they call the cash and carry policy, which basically says, okay, well, we can sell war materials to nations at war as long as they pay cash, so we don't have that loan issue to deal with, where we don't feel like we're committed to one nation winning a war because big time American banks have made, billions in loans or whatever. And then carry is in come get it yourself, so we don't have any more Lusitania type incidents where we're having to smuggle it in on cruise ships and the Germans sink them and American citizens are killed. That didn't last long. Cash and carry is ultimately replaced by lend-lease, which means here you go, anything that you need to defeat Nazi Germany, we got you. America will direct segments of its economy to producing whatever war materials you need, from tanks and planes to guns and troop transports or whatever else. Borrow it, whatever, pay for it later. We got what you need. So it's a complete reversal of that neutrality policy. And Franklin Roosevelt announces that, this is very clearly, and certainly more so than the Great War, perhaps actually a war to defend democracy. Again, having to ignore the whole Russia thing. The fact that very clearly the Soviet Union is not a democracy, but they are at least at present time the enemy of my enemy, right? So FDR says we're going to be the arsenal of democracy. We're going to support Britain with everything we've got. We'll support the French resistance. And we'll do everything we can. In fact, you know what? We'll support the Soviet Union too. Lend-Lease. America, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, might well have given the Russians more through Lend-Lease than they did the British. In fact, the great Russian general, Marshal Zhukov, acknowledging what I said earlier, that of course the war in Europe couldn't have been won without the Red Army on the Eastern Front, but he adds, in addition to that, we the Red Army, couldn't have done it without Lend-Lease. So, and that probably wasn't a popular thing to express in the Soviet Union at the time, that the Russians couldn't have done it without America, and America couldn't have done it without the Russians. That being said, events in the Pacific would soon drag America directly into the war. Japan had been flexing its imperialist muscle as it could since the late 19th century. Japan very quickly adopts Western values, industrializes, and positions itself such that it would not be colonized, it would become itself a colonizer. It would become an imperialist nation. I think we had talked about before in the imperialism lecture, they pretty quickly invade and overtake Korea on the Pacific or the Asian mainland. They invade Manchuria here, to the northeast of China proper. Here's Korea. Here are the Japanese islands. And then in the mid and late 1930s, they actually invade China, which was in the throes of a civil war, which we'll discuss in here. We have a whole lecture committed to China, another lecture committed to China, the rise of the communists in China. China was in the throes of a civil war, which they more or less put on pause in order to unite together to fight this Japanese invasion. America is, of course, aware of this. You think back to the end of the Great War, too. Japan had been gifted, it was on the Allied side in the Great War, Japan, and had been gifted German colonies in the Pacific for its contribution when the Germans were defeated. And here they are, extending their rule into Korea and Manchuria and into parts of northeastern China. So they're becoming a bona fide imperialist power in the Pacific. And then consider what happens when World War II breaks out. Think about this. So prior to World War II, this is British India, British Burma or Myanmar, Siam or Thailand, French Indochina or Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, the Dutch East Indies, the American Philippines, and so on. Well, what happens when the British, French, and Dutch are all fighting for their life against the Nazis? They don't have time to send troops over here to defend their colonies, so guess what? British Burma, Siam become Japanese Burma and Siam. French Indochina becomes Japanese Indochina. The Dutch East Indies become the Japanese East Indies. They take all of these colonies from these imperialist powers while they're busy fighting against Nazi Germany. Or in the case of France, being outright defeated, and also, I guess, the Dutch as well, by the Nazis. And so, by late 1941, my point is, the only thing standing in the way of total Japanese domination of the entirety of East Asia and the Pacific is America. And they have, just as an imperialist nation would, they've got now all this rice that's produced down here, and all the latex, and all of the oil down here. And so all these resources, and America knows this, and tries to put a stop to Japan's rise by placing embargoes on Japan. Saying American companies, you can't sell oil or steel to Japan, and so on. And so some in the leadership of the Japanese government feel like the only way for them to sort of take that next step to counteract, American resistance to the rise of Japan as the great ruler of all of East Asia and the Pacific, or their policy of, quote, Asia for Asians, which really just meant get these Westerners out of here and it'll be, Japanese Asia, was to attack the United States. To devise some master stroke to attack America everywhere it had military personnel, anywhere all throughout the Pacific, and issue a blow from which, not that the United States would never recover, but such that by the time America did recover, that you would be able to enter into some kind of peace agreement that would allow you to hang on to a lot of this. And that would sort of position you at the top of the pecking order for imperialist powers in the Pacific. I haven't mentioned this, but the government of Japan is basically fascist. I mean, they didn't call themselves that. They didn't openly espouse, the idea that they were fascist. But they have an emperor, so it's an autocratic government. The emperor, though, by this time was more of a figurehead. Mm-hmm. And the actual leadership of Japan at that time was essentially top military brass. So they've got like a military junta type government, if you will. And they're hyper-nationalist, right? So that's like fascism. They're obviously militantly expansionist, which is akin to fascism, right? They reject, ideas like socialism or liberal democracy, which would make them then akin to the fascist government. So they're kind of a natural ally to Nazi Germany anyway. And obviously, Nazi Germany would be happy if America was bogged down fighting a war in the Pacific and Asia against Japan, because that would mean America couldn't quickly send, or perhaps couldn't at all send troops to Europe to aid Britain, right, and the Soviet Union. So, the alliance of Imperial Japan with Nazi Germany is, for a number of reasons, a convenient and natural one. And so it perhaps makes sense that they would enter the war on the side of Nazi Germany for the Axis powers. So they devised this plan to unleash in December of 1941, and I think everybody knows that this is when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. The Hawaiian Islands would be out here, further out in the Pacific towards America, where America had a major naval base. It's where it kept all of its battleships and aircraft carriers, which the Japanese knew from information from spies, intelligence. But I think people don't realize that on that same day and the next day, they also attacked the American Philippines, they attacked Guam, they attacked Wake Island. Everywhere America had troops or an installation, the Japanese attacked on that day. It was a much more massive and coordinated attack than just the incidents at Pearl Harbor would lead you to believe. And Pearl Harbor, of course, was bad enough. They destroyed several ships, perhaps not as many as they would like. They killed around 2,000 people. And as it would turn out, in the words of one Japanese commander who feared that this might backfire, they, quote, awakened the sleeping giant. Again, the thinking was that if you could expand your control to this vast sphere, by the time, you sucker punched America, by the time they sort of fought their way back, maybe to eventually a stalemate, that you could enter into some kind of peace agreement that would still allow you to control most of this. Of course, that's not what happened. And America bounces back pretty quickly. It's clear by early 1942 with the Battle of Midway, which is fought over this tiny little island, obviously about midway through, in the Pacific from Asia to America. Just a little tiny airstrip. But as the war in the Pacific would demonstrate, you had to fight over those little tiny islands. They're strategic, some of them. And what happens at Midway is not a major land battle. It's this first massive clash between navies and air forces, between aircraft carriers that have fighter planes that take off from them that dogfight up in the sky with other fighter planes, and battleships and destroyers. And it's a battle that the United States wins, and that's important because, again, this big blow in December of 41 was supposed to, set America back. Right? It's supposed to be, again, not a blow from which they didn't think America would ever recover, but certainly that it wouldn't recover that quickly. And so Midway signals to the Japanese that they've got a fight on their hands. But if you're the United States, you have to reckon with the fact that, look, the Japanese have occupied all of these islands in the Pacific and fortified them. And you couldn't just bypass all that and steam right for the main Japanese islands. You would have to, work your way through these strategically and take this little island with an airfield and take that island with a naval base. And you would have to win naval battles, too, to even be able to assault these islands in the first place. That's what it's going to look like, the island hopping campaign. And it would start down here for one reason, because Australia, an ally and former British colony, was in danger of being overrun by the Japanese. And that's pretty much all you had left at that time. So after Midway, the first thing the U.S. does, you win a major battle down here at Coral Sea against the Japanese. So you got 2 victories in your pocket, and you start selecting island groups and specific islands within them these are the ones we want to assault. And you start down here in the Solomon Islands with Guadalcanal. And Guadalcanal, like many of these other battles, is going to be especially bloody. And consider this. When you attack a tiny little island, there's no guesswork from the enemy, like where you're going to land. I mean, there's only so much beach. So you've got artillery, mortar fire, machine gun fire, sniper fire, all trained on that beach. And when that first wave of American Marines or soldiers from the Army come ashore, the casualty rates are incredibly high. Your chance of survival is very low. But through overwhelming force, you have to take the beachhead, and then from there, you've got to take the rest of the island. And then, sometimes these are mountainous islands, they're jungle. The Japanese have built tunnels and caves and bunkers. They generally have a policy of not surrendering until literally the last person is dead. And so it could take, weeks, months to take some of these tiny little islands, and you take on tens of thousands of casualties in the process. But you take the Solomons by taking Guadalcanal, and you move on to the Gilbert Islands, and then to the Marshall Islands, the Caroline Islands, New Guinea. You take Peleliu, and you move on from there. Very slow process. So this, while the Russians are fighting the Germans on the Eastern Front, this is what the bulk of American troops are doing in this island hopping campaign. And then eventually you get to the point where you could win another major naval battle here at Leyte Gulf, and you could retake the Philippines. Meanwhile, American and British troops are active over here in the Asian mainland, working with the Chinese to try to defeat the Japanese there. And in some cases, American special forces are operating hundreds of miles behind Japanese enemy lines to work with Chinese resistance to dislodge the Japanese, and the same in Vietnam and so on. By 1944, the island hopping campaign, through great loss and great struggle, had been successful enough where you could take Iwo Jima, which is where they, at the top of Mount Suribachi, they famously raised the American flag, and you have this iconic photograph. Have you seen this? And it was for a time America's World War II memorial. America now has a much larger World War II memorial in Washington, and this is just the Marine Corps memorial. Misspelled Suribachi, so that's great. You recognize that?
Yeah.
Yeah. And that becomes the memorial. I'm going to exercise great restraint here and not Google Earth the Marine Corps Memorial. So today is a day of restraint, but there it is. A couple of films were made about, or at least one about the taking of that photograph, which apparently was staged, but it's almost like, who cares? I mean,
Yeah.
The United States takes Iwo Jima and it takes Okinawa. America to this day has a base on Okinawa. That's a Japanese home island. So we're not just talking about taking from the Japanese islands that they had taken. These are part of the original nation state, if you will, of Japan. What's more, and I should emphasize on that point, these were fiercely defended, and so the battles to take Iwo Jima and Okinawa were bloodier perhaps than many of those that had come before. What else is significant about these two, and I should include along with that Tinian. Oops. Okay. Once you have those three, you're close enough to begin bombing raids of the main three Japanese islands themselves. You've now gotten close enough to where you can start bombing Japan proper. And the U.S. will set up airstrips in those three for explicitly that purpose. To try to bomb Japan to the point where they would surrender, well, of course, they will not surrender. And so that will continue as you move forward with your plans in Europe. But here's a sort of better look at the advance of the island hopping strategy. Starting down here with Coral Sea and then the battles to take the Solomon Islands, most especially Guadalcanal, the Gilbert Islands, most especially Tarawa, and then the Marshalls and the Caroline Islands from there, the Palau Islands, including Peleliu. That positions you to move to the Marianas here and also into Leyte Gulf, major naval battle, and then you can retake the Philippines, retake the Dutch East Indies, continue your efforts in Burma and Indochina, and then eventually, as I said, take Iwo Jima, Tinian, and Okinawa. There's Midway, by the way, and here are the Hawaiian Islands, including the naval base at Pearl Harbor. The technology of warfare in the Pacific, battleships, aircraft carriers, fighter planes, the devastation of these amphibious assaults. I think a lot is said and known in American popular memory about the Normandy invasion that we're about to talk about, and how difficult that was for the Allies to gain control of that beach in France. But again, consider here that unlike in France where the Germans had to guess where the Allies were going to land, there's no guesswork in these battles. And so the initial waves of troops coming ashore had it unfathomably difficult, trying to survive these amphibious assaults, these first waves. And then from there to have to fight for days and weeks in jungle and mountainous terrain to root the Japanese army out of every nook and cranny was incredibly difficult too. Back to Europe though. by 1944, the Allies and Eisenhower, whom you mentioned earlier, the Supreme Allied Commander, had determined that it was time to unleash Operation Overlord. That invasion that they had been planning for so long of Nazi-occupied France and Western Europe. Germans occupied all of this, including, of course, the city of Paris, Belgium, the Netherlands, all of northern France. Everything south of there was a puppet government of the French that was at the bidding of the Nazi regime. But again, you had promised Stalin, and you knew you had to at some point, especially when your advance in Italy bogs down here, you had to at some point invade up here to force the Germans to move some resources from the eastern and southern fronts over there. And so it was in June of 1944 that Operation Overlord goes forth. As part of this invasion, the plan was to drop paratroopers out of planes in the cover of darkness the night before, all throughout northern France here, so that they could begin the process of trying to take out like big guns, big artillery that were aimed at the beach, to make it a little bit easier the next morning when Allied troops actually came ashore. Also part of this operation, for months the Allies had been putting out over the airwaves and elsewhere false information, fake intelligence.
Didn't they plant like tanks, like fake tanks in Britain?
They built an entire camp.
They put like Patton up there too.
Yeah. They built an entire camp and positioned resources in another part of England to make it look like this is where they were training, to make it seem to the Germans to reinforce that fake intelligence, all of which was designed to make Hitler and the High German Command believe the invasion was going to happen right there. That is where Calais is in France. That's where the Channel Tunnel is. There's a tunnel underneath the English Channel you can drive through now, because it's the shortest point between Britain and France. So it's an obvious choice, right? And like you said, they've got these fake tanks and installations and even top, generals visiting there to make it look like this is where it's going to happen. And Hitler was convinced. It worked with Hitler. Others of his commanders are not so sure, but Hitler is Hitler.
Yeah, so they put all their troops right there.
All their best troops, including and Rommel. Rommel is the top tank commander of the Panzer divisions from the battles of northern Africa and such. And so Hitler has Rommel stationed right here, to pounce whenever the Allies land, right? Just as you say. Mm-hmm. It was not true, of course. The invasion was planned to occur further down here in Normandy. And of course, it's not going to be easy. The Germans had had years to fortify the whole damn coast, but it was a little bit easier if you knew Rommel was, hundreds of miles away, right? That if you were able to gain the beachhead, you'd have a little breathing room, a little time before the best that Germany had to throw at you could get at you, right? Does that make sense? And so, June 6, 1944, Eisenhower addresses the troops and says, you're about to embark upon the great crusade towards which we have striven these many months. And the eyes of freedom-loving people everywhere are upon you. And so they embarked in the fog across the choppy waters of the English Channel for Normandy. And imagine on these Higgins boats, these troop transports, when that door goes down and that very first wave of troops sets out in the water, you couldn't get all the way up on the beach for the barriers the Germans had put there. You had to now advance. Look at that wide expanse with nothing for cover. And there are, up on these ridges, bunkers, machine guns, of course the artillery that remained, what your paratroopers couldn't take out the night before, which, by the way, half of them got scattered and dropped in places they weren't supposed to be because of the anti-aircraft fire they came under. Which, by the way, awakened the Germans to the notion that this was about to happen the next day. The casualty rates are incredibly high, particularly in certain sectors of Normandy, codename Omaha Beach being the worst. There's a great film from the late 90s, Saving Private Ryan. Have you seen it?
No.
It's a Steven Spielberg film starring Tom Hanks and Matt Damon and some others. The opening sequence is like 30 minutes just depicting this, which some veterans watched and were like, man, that's actually, you'll never get to experience what actual combat was like, but that was pretty damn close.
When they have to like pretend to be dead next to the like dead bodies.
Yeah, but I mean, the Germans, they got machine gunners up there that could just continually spray the beach, and so you're trying to use these barriers for cover, which are pretty flimsy for cover, and it was more or less through overwhelming force and wave after wave that the U.S. and the British and the Canadians were able to take this beachhead, and again, through your intelligence work, you've been able to make sure that you had that little breathing room in terms of securing the beachhead and moving forward before you had to take on the best of the German panzer divisions. And then you have to sort of begin taking town after town, from Carentan to Caen and others, making your way through the hedgerows of northern France in very fierce fighting and move up to try to liberate Paris. Mm-hmm. But they do. And then that winter, you have to sustain, or you have to take Germany's sort of best counterpunch. And the last major German offensive on the Western Front that results in the Battle of the Bulge. The Battle of the Bulge because it was successful enough to produce like a bulge in the line that pushed the Allies back. And one group of American troops gets surrounded here in the forests of southern Belgium and northern France for a time. But they hold out, they break out, the punch is taken, and by the spring of 45, the Allies are on the march again. They invade Germany itself in Hürtgen Forest in early 45, by which time you were close enough to start bombing German cities. And this had become a total war in which it was accepted as a fait accompli that you would kill civilians even on purpose. Even the Allies. And so America begins, and Britain begins, not just bombing, but firebombing German cities. Like, famously, if you read Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse 5, it's about the firebombing of Dresden, which, as a prisoner of war, Vonnegut survived remarkably, because he was in a meat locker, many feet below the earth. Firebombing involves dropping incendiary materials, like precursors to what would later be what we call napalm, a bomb you dropped intended to start a fire, with a thick petroleum-like substance. Then you drop conventional bombs, which spread that fire, which envelop a city in a firestorm, which would burn the city literally to the ground, and result in literally tens of thousands of civilian deaths. I mean, you incinerate these cities and burn or otherwise kill tens of thousands of civilians, the idea being that perhaps this would cause the Nazis to surrender. But the Nazis, in terms of decision-making, equals Hitler. And as we know, Hitler, like the Imperial Japanese government, was not going to surrender. Meanwhile, you're continuing to push north in the Italian front. That remains slow going, but there is some advancement there, as you can see. More importantly, the Russians, the Red Army, continues to advance on the Eastern Front. So that around about the same time, Britain and America and the Canadians, and a reconstituted French force, I should say, are able to push through into Germany here, make some gains here. The Red Army is knocking on the door of Germany over here at the very same time, making a final push. And in fact, it will be they who make it into the city of Berlin first. Berlin is the capital of Germany, it's right there. And by late spring 1945, Russian soldiers are in the streets of Berlin. This soldier, who received the Order of Lenin, places the Soviet flag on the German Reichstag, or Parliament building, captured in that iconic photo. While this was occurring, Hitler committed suicide in a bunker beneath the city. And then and only then do what's left of his major commanders surrender to the Allies, unconditionally. Meaning they are so defeated that they would have to accept whatever terms that the Russians, British, and Americans and others imposed upon them. But you still got to end the war in the Pacific. Some photos first. what it looked like fighting. When I say the hedgerows, this is a hedgerow. Not ideal to be fighting in conditions like that where you don't know what's on the other side. So fighting in and out of those little towns in the north of France was very difficult. But this is what it looks like once you gain the beachhead and you can start offloading thousands of trucks and troop transports and tanks and other war materials to prepare you for the even greater work of liberating France and pushing on to Germany. Soldiers fighting in Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. You know, it's bad enough to have to take the best blow that Nazi Germany could deliver in a last gasp effort, but to have to do it in the dead of winter in snow and ice and freezing cold, and to have to live in these foxholes and in the forest and withstand German artillery barrage after barrage was something incredible for sure. Something incredible and terrible too, the results of firebombing on the left, the remains of those who had been killed in the streets of Dresden and those who had survived. And bottom right is an aerial image of Tokyo. The vast majority of which you can see is on fire. I say this in full knowledge that you probably know the event, what actually brings an end to the war against Japan. And so I hope it has the impact I intend when I say this, not what we know is coming, but this, the firebombing of Tokyo is the single deadliest event of World War II. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but upwards, I think, of 100,000 people are killed in the firebombing of Tokyo.
Tokyo's that's their capital.
That is the capital of Japan. It was and is one of the most populous cities on earth.
Because they had a previous capital. I think it was like, I don't remember what their previous capital. I don't remember when they moved it.
I lied. I can't. It's a compulsion. I mean, I just have to do it, I guess.
If you weren't going to do it, I was going to do it.
Good. You know, and LG talked to a former colleague of mine, or not former, current colleague, a different campus. It confuses me because she lives downtown. Who said, you know, that's absurd. Why would you Google Earth every single class? Maybe once or twice. Well, no. I'm more committed than ever. I'm going to do it every single time now. I mean, look, you can even see without satellite view how incredibly densely populated. I mean, look at that. One of the most densely populated areas on the planet.
Yep. You don't even need cars.
Right? And this, look, I mean, that speaks to, of course, the way that America approaches the post-war period too. And I'll say a word or two about that on the final slide. So that's what's occurring by 1945 in the Pacific. When the war in Europe is over, America then shifts its attention and literally starts shifting its troops from Europe to the Pacific and towards an inevitable invasion of the three main Japanese islands. And look there, I mean, the plans are literally drawn up. The idea would be that you would invade Japan in much the same way you had invaded Nazi-occupied France. You would drop paratroopers in there, and you would then engage in what would undoubtedly surpass Overlord and Normandy as the greatest amphibious invasion in the history of warfare. This was the plan. The emperor in Japan issues a directive to his people saying, you know, basically, men, women, and children, you're going to fight to the end. And you knew that this fighting would be the most fierce of any in the Pacific and perhaps of the entire war to date. American commanders estimate, you know, perhaps as many as 2 million American casualties as a result of the invasion of the Japanese main islands. FDR dies in office. He actually dies here in the state of Georgia in Warm Springs, finally succumbing to his illnesses. And his vice president at the time, Harry Truman, becomes president. And thus it's put into Truman's lap the decision whether to move forward with an invasion of Japan or to unleash what had been developed during the Manhattan Project. Truman was made aware that American and expatriate German scientists working in the deserts of New Mexico had developed and tested the world's first atomic bomb. They'd figured out how to split an atom and unleash that incredible energy, and with just one bomb, and they had two different types using either uranium or plutonium.
One of them was called like Fat Boy, right?
You got Little Boy and Fat Man. Yeah. We have this way of putting catchy little names on these horrible, horrible things, like island hopping and Fat Man and Little Boy, which are the deadliest weapons ever created by humankind. Many thousands of times more powerful than any conventional bomb ever devised. And once they successfully tested it out there in the desert in secret, they realized that with one weapon, they could perhaps annihilate literally an entire city. And so Truman has this decision to make. Do we go and drop one of these bombs on a Japanese city and, incinerate and blow up an entire city and kill, again, many tens of thousands of civilians, which I guess wasn't that big of a leap when you'd already done it by firebombing Tokyo and other cities? Or do you authorize the invasion of Japan and risk, 2 million American casualties in the process? And Truman, of course, chooses option one. A bomber takes off from Tinian, where my grandfather served in the Pacific, and sets out for the Japanese city of Hiroshima in the south of Japan. Drops one of these bombs, and Hiroshima is destroyed as predicted. I think there are something like 80,000 people are killed. In the center of the blast radius core, literally everything is incinerated immediately. For miles outside of that, it's the wind blast where everything is destroyed. And then, of course, what's even more terrifying about an atomic bomb after the fact? Releases radiation. And radiation you can't detect, but it's poisonous to the human body, and it will kill you, give you cancer, and so on. And so many people are killed from the radiation fallout who survived the blast. But Japan does not surrender, and so 2 days later, America drops a second bomb on the city of Nagasaki, which kills slightly fewer people for probably the only reason that Nagasaki was a little bit smaller and less densely populated. And so you had demonstrated to Japan your ability to literally annihilate the Japanese people, which would seem like a pretty no-brainer reason to unconditionally surrender at that point. And the Japanese do, and America will occupy Japan for many decades to come. And unlike in Europe where you have the British and the French and the Canadians and the Russians, it's just America here.
You still have like a naval base.
We do. We have several, in fact. I mentioned at Okinawa we still have Marine Corps and I think maybe naval base too, yeah. And it actually has been in the news of the last few years because of the potential threat from China. Deliberately, Japan was prevented for many, many years from having any kind of robust military. The thinking is we're going to build up Japan economically to be a good trading partner, but we're going to make sure they're never a military threat. We're going to put in place a friendly government that we can be allies with. And America and Japan have remained, until this presidency, really strong allies. What was my point? What were you asking?
Military force now?
Yeah. Of the last few years, the thinking was, look, China's trying to seize these islands and flexing its naval muscle here and there, and don't we need more than just a civil defense force? And so that's been kind of a back and forth with Japan these last few years. Image of Hiroshima, part of Hiroshima, or what's left of it anyway.
Knocks down a pretty big. This is a nuke map.
I actually routinely use that, and in fact, in the Cold War lecture, and if I don't, you'll remind me.
Okay.
I'm going to use that to demonstrate the difference between, it allows you to select the different kinds of weapons, like bombs. I'm going to demonstrate the deadliness of these original atomic bombs versus a thermonuclear weapon, like the Tsar bomb, right?
Yeah, it's not even comparable.
No, it's
because like the blast radius. Let's see what you were talking about. The blast radius. The wind is like.
It's terrifying and almost unfathomable. So yeah, during the Cold War lecture, don't let me get by without pulling that up for sure. And this will set that up, in fact, the Cold War lecture. And just to backtrack a little bit, in the closing couple of years of the war, there are another two major conferences of where the big three get together. First at Yalta. This image is from Yalta. There's another one of them smiling for the cameras, and this particular one you can see this one was snapped when they weren't quite ready for the photo, and they all look tired, don't they? I mean, Stalin here, maybe less so than the other two, but even he has a sort of gaunt look to him. FDR obviously was very sick by that point. And there's Churchill, all at Yalta, where they discussed what was at that point then, because of the gains the Soviets had made in Eastern Europe, the Red Army occupation of Eastern Europe. And Churchill and FDR are trying to say to Stalin, look, you've quote unquote liberated these places like Poland and Czechoslovakia and Romania. You need to allow those people to, have self-determination, have elections to put new governments in place as they see fit. And Stalin gives lip service to that, but the thinking is this is not going to happen. That it would not be in the Soviet interest to allow there to be capitalist, liberal democratic governments in those places. And the thinking was perhaps the Soviets were going to install instead communist governments that will be loyal to them, which is in fact eventually what happens. The Soviets and Americans and British do agree, though, to the formation of a United Nations to replace the old League of Nations, of which, as you remember, America was not a part, and to be this world peacekeeping body which all the nations of the world hopefully could have representation in, to resolve conflicts in the future, to avoid another world war, to mediate disputes, and so on. So at least there at Yalta, it is agreed upon that there will be a United Nations. America will be a member. As we'll talk about in the Cold War lecture, these big three, along with another couple of nations, France and China, would be members of a inner circle, if you will, a security council that would be, the major players, because they're the ones that have won the war. They're the ones that have won the war that has established this new world order, if you will. And then finally, Potsdam. And the big three have changed at this point. Stalin is, of course, still there. He's not going anywhere until he dies. But there is Truman, and that's Clement Attlee. Churchill's party, the Tory party in England, had been defeated in elections. The way it works over there, whoever gets a majority in Parliament gets to put their guy in as prime minister. But then if your party loses the majority of seats or doesn't have a coalition, somebody else does. And by that time, the Labour Party, which is their more liberal left-wing party, had come to power. And so Attlee has replaced Churchill. Churchill remained incredibly popular. In fact, we'll talk about in the Cold War lecture, he comes to America and goes on a speaking tour, where he's very, very popular with the American people. But Attlee is there at Potsdam with Truman and, of course, Stalin. And they continue to push Stalin on this question of self-determination. But it has become increasingly clear that Stalin intends for Eastern Europe to be a buffer zone. His posture is that the Soviet Union or Russia had been invaded numerous times by the nations of Central or Western Europe. Think back even all the way to Napoleon. And what they needed there in Eastern Europe was governments that were friendly to them. And if you're a communist government, the way to get nations friendly to you at that time was not to have a free and fair election. And so what they do is they eliminate any vestiges, any remnants of the previous governments of those countries, and they install in their place communist governments which they could control. And thereby create this buffer zone, which the U.S. and Britain see as a threat to their interests. The Soviets simply installing communist governments where there had been capitalist, liberal, democratic ones before. And so it's become clear that, you know, if it hadn't been already, it's become more clear, I guess I should say, that you've got these stark ideological differences with your great ally. And you have to begin to wonder what happens when you no longer have that common enemy. When the Nazi regime is eliminated, and consider in Germany where you occupy one half of the country and they, the Russians, occupy the other half. What's going to happen in Germany is one immediate question. Would there be two Germanys maybe? And if there's one, you know, what's going to happen? What does the government of that Germany look like? Well, the Russians are going to have a say in that. You know, the Red Army was arguably the most powerful and battle-hardened army on the planet. I mean, yes, if you consider combined military forces and naval and air forces, it's easily America, and America has the bomb. But if we're talking specifically about your army, and the Red Army is tip-top of the world. So whatever they want to do in Eastern Europe, they're going to do it. And if you have a problem with that, you have to start thinking about, my God, are we looking at World War III or World War II Part 2, which nobody wanted.
It's all built up through the Cold War.
Exactly. This is exactly where I'm going. This all is what you are faced with in the late 1940s as you realize you're entering into a new phase where this great power, this superpower, and really you have two superpowers in the world, and we're looking at the big three, but let's be honest, it's America and the Soviet Union. But by proxy, America's allies like Britain on your side too, your staunch allies, your liberal, democratic, capitalist allies. And then the Soviet Union, and you couldn't be more different ideologically, politically, economically, in terms of your geopolitical outlook. But nobody wanted to fight a war directly with one another, particularly by the 50s, and we're going to talk about thermonuclear weapons. The Russians are not far behind. And so once they have those weapons and you have those weapons, you have new ways to deploy those weapons. By the 50s, a war between these two would not only be catastrophic in terms of conventional warfare, you're looking at the possibility of annihilating one another through nuclear warfare, and perhaps even causing the death of all life on Earth. And so what develops instead is a Cold War where you fight it out in terms of rhetoric and brinksmanship and what we call proxy wars, where there are revolutions and civil wars all throughout the world where you support one side and the Russians support another. Occasionally, one or the other sends troops to fight themselves, but never both. So a Cold War meaning you don't ever fight one another directly, but you fight it out in so many other ways for decades.
It's like a chessboard, like two players.
Absolutely. In fact, I think one of the images we'll have in the Cold War PowerPoint is an American diplomat gazing out over a chessboard. And we'll talk about America's containment policy that dominates American foreign policy for much of that Cold War. So that is that, right on time.